onto icons. I'll show you what I'm talking about. On the side here, buttons we could click, options. They don't always need to be obviously along the edges like this. It's very similar to the buttons we used before. You can use the same template you have before for your buttons. And you just need the loop section of it. You can copy and paste it. And you're going to need 2 loops this time. So you take your loop and you'd paste it inside of another loop. In this case I have a loop from 1 to 2 with a loop from 1 to 5 in it. What this is eventually going to represent is that you click for a unit, the unit appears here, and this information is filled in for him. So triggers are going to maintain all of that for me. Whatever I set here, this is my Y position, my height. I'm starting up here. And I'm going to work down from there with these 5. So this is my static one. My Y is my static. That's how I know I'm working down. If I wanted to work across, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this would be X. I would need my X to be my static value. So your first position value up here is your static value that is going to determine whether you're working to the right or you're working down. In my case, I'm working down. So Y is static. At the end, again, this is my normal button loop. At the end of it, you're going to modify that value. Your Y position, this is my start, 255. This is button 2, button 3, button 4, button 5. Ignore that. Then once I get to button 5, right, the second loop here has been exhausted. And now I'm at, plus 500. I'm at roughly Y position 600. I need to reset that for my second line. So after this loop expires, I modify my X position. It brings me from this line over here over 920, and now I'm down here. I don't want to be down here. I want to be back at the start, which is why I have my Y position as a static value. So it finishes and jumps me over to here, and then when it starts again, it brings me back to the top. And this is what's going to give me my 2 lines going down. And if I set this to X, and I set this to X, and I set this to Y, I would make lines going across. Alright, understood? Simple. Now temp int, it's a little different. Up here we could use index 2 to save our variable. We can no longer do that because we have 2 lines. If we were to use index 2 to save our variables, it would save 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which means the first 5 would be overridden. You wouldn't be able to use them. So by modifying temp int, it increases 1 per index. You get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So instead of referencing index or index 2, we reference temp int. The next part is that portrait in the middle. It had the icon of the dude with the sword standing there, or not even the icon, it was a model on a dialogue, which looks really cool. A lot of people like them. And few people use them because I think it's something giant and complex. It isn't. You get your X and your Y size, your X and your Y position. You should know how to do that by now. I'm going to skip these first 2 for a second. We're going to start right with the portrait. Create a portrait for dialogue item, or last created dialogue. A portrait is just a dialogue item type. And you would think that unit model would be the dialogue item type that you want because we're going to show a unit model, and that does nothing. Don't use it. I don't know why it doesn't work properly, but it doesn't. You need a portrait type dialogue item. When you create a dialogue item that isn't from a template, this is a template that Blizzard created because they're nice, where you fill all this information in. Portraits are less common, so they don't come with a template, which means that you have to set all that information yourself. So first we're going to set the portrait to the variable because I need to change this later as different buttons are clicked. We need to show it, and we need to move it. It's the same as up here where it says create it at this point or anchored to this point. We just need to manually move it. Move last created dialog item, which is the portrait, to the X and Y position. And then we have to set the size of it, because initially it's going to start at 0, 0, which is your corners, and it's going to be size 0, 0, which means you're not going to see it. So you have to set the size of it also. Pretty simple. It's just not all in one line like you might be used to. Just like with our dialogue, we hid the background and border of our dialogue. We want to hide the border and the background of this dialogue item, because the border and the background look like shit and you don't want none of that. So we're going to hide those, and that's what this is. This is a background image, and it's the same as your main dialogue way up here where you created the background. Same thing, you can copy and paste those, and now you have a background down here. You can set those to whatever you want, a field, a happy tree, whatever, you know, Bob Ross, it's yours to own. And you're going to end with a border, because again, you hid your border. So this is my background, and this is my border. You should understand that concept. That's why I went over it first, so it's out of the way, and we're going to keep going with the portraits. So now that you have a portrait, you have to set the model for the portrait, right? And you can pick any model from the entire list of models. If you know you're just creating a single model, chances are it's going to be something that you're going to want to move. So one thing you can do, set last created dialog item model to, got to convert a string to a game link, and then you got to convert a game link back to a string. It's a pain in the ass. Game link to string. String to game link to string. String, now we need to convert the unit type. Right? So this only works if your unit and your actor for the unit have the same ID in the data editor. So if you have, if you are the kind of person who duplicates a lot of units and then doesn't properly rename them, you're going to have issues with this. If, in this case, it's the Admiral, if the unit's name is Admiral, his model needs to be Admiral, because I'm fetching the unit's name to then set the model to the unit, or not the name, the the unique ID for it. A really good trick for this that is absolutely worth pointing out, I have a UI dialog. So the entire time that my game is being played, the entire screen is an invisible dialogue that players just don't know is there. Even my loading screen, the game starts and the loading bar is done, and this stays up, and the game is already done loading, and most people don't know it. And it just is automatically here. And then I can kind of fade the start in so it doesn't look so jumpy. And I also preload stuff during this screen. So minor fact. What I also use this screen for is texts and pop-ups when a unit enters a region. I can fade text onto the screen that says, you've entered this region, and then fade it back away. This is an achievement. When you finish a quest, there's a big pop-up with a reward, and that's what this section is just that giant icon, and it plays a sound. Again, that's just dialogue items on a dialogue. And the most important thing, especially for anyone who's making a game that's immersion based, is that weather weather is bad in Starcraft 2. Weather creates a lot of lag. If you play on low settings, you don't see weather anyway. So with this full screen dialogue, you can create a portrait, which is what this is. You can set the portrait to be the full size, and right now there's no model for it, so you don't see it. And every game everyone plays, this is in effect the entire time, and most people don't know it until they enter a region with weather, and then most of the time they don't realize it's a dialogue doing it. So I have a full screen portrait dialogue, like we are currently making. And when a unit enters a region, let's say you enter a snowy forest, I can just run a trigger to set the dialogue item model to snow, and then snow starts falling over the entire screen. Or if you're in a lava area, I can make ash blowing across the screen, or wind, or smoke, or fog, or darkness, or plan anything, any model you want, but the example I'm trying to give is weather. And it's completely lagless because it's just a single model instead of all these different moving physics and lighting and all that. It's just a single model. It's a great way to add immersion to a game. It's very simple because once you create this once, you can copy and paste it anytime you might ever need it again. That was just a little aside. Let's continue here. Alright, so incredibly important. Whenever you change your model for this portrait dialogue, you need to wait. Wait for portrait to load. You get that? You see that? Wait for portrait to load. You have to wait for the portrait to load. Get portrait ID from last created dialogue item. That's why this is set to a variable, so when I change it later, I'm going to reference this variable. You need to wait for it to load before you can send an actor message. You're going to need to set the scale. The line in the middle that we skipped is also very important. Set portrait render type. The render type has to be LDR. If you set it to HDR, it doesn't stick to your dialogue. It gets either put in front of everything or behind everything. It will not work properly. Last part is very similar to this part, just a little different, so I thought I'd go over it briefly. This is good for anyone that makes a stat screen, really, is the best use for it if you're displaying the stats of a hero or something. In this case, I just picked name, level, and cost, but I use it for my stat screen where I have strength, endurance, agility, whatever all my stats are. And then on the right side I have the values, which are loaded in by a variable later. We use our X and our Y position. I don't use an X and a Y size because these are labels. And as long as your label is large enough to hold all the text that you're putting into it, it doesn't matter what dimensions you make it. You can make it 30,000 pixels wide, and there's no real negative side effect as long as your words line up. If it's too short, they'll get cut off. So as long as it's not too short, you're fine. I'm going to address this image last. So it's pretty simple. You create a label just like you created at the top. You can copy and paste that so you don't have to do the X minus, Y minus, all that stuff going on. This is your first word, your static values, we'll call it, name, level, and cost. They'll always appear in a line down the dialogue. And then to the right is what we're going to set by variable. I'm going to have the unit name set, the unit level set, and the cost of the unit are all going to be set with a variable. So after you create your first one, you copy and paste that exact thing, and you just move the X position over. You want the Y the same because you want your text to line up, obviously. So you move your X position over to where it looks good. I've already made this, so I know it's 110. It's one of those trial and error things, though. You take a guess, you move it back and forth. It doesn't take long to figure out, and that's the one that you're going to want to set to a variable because that's the one that you're going to have to modify in the future. This, I explained in the first video, this game menu difficulty glow works really good if it's put behind text, especially if you're the kind of person that likes to do colored text, because colored text is stupid. If you have a player name, instead of writing the player name in a color, you could put this color and the player's color behind the text, and it makes it easier to read. Reading, a purple player's name is difficult on a dark dialogue. So this is going to be a long line behind the text that we've created. Alright, there we are. Pretty simple. This is my portrait. I have it hidden behind a border. My dude's in there. You see his sword is kind of poking through the bottom there. It just means I gotta move him up a little or scale him down a little. It's a little tricky to get it lined up perfectly because different models are different sizes. I got my labels in a line here. I'm going to move them over and down, and I gotta change it a bit in general. Got my buttons running in a line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Later they're going to update on game start. I'm going to space them out a bit more. Probably find a better border. I was just trying a different border. It looks like shit though. But everything's here. Pretty simple. If you already learned part 1 pretty easily, part 2 shouldn't have been too difficult for you. It just mainly was to teach this portrait and how to make a bunch of buttons if you got to make a bunch of buttons. Part 3, I'm going to be triggering all of this. How, to click this, update this dude, update all this. I'm going to show you how to set variables. I assume all of you know how to set variables. That is the end of this tutorial though. Hopefully I taught somebody something. Good luck.